Well, let's turn to the Leicestershire County School of Music, which has enriched the lives of thousands of Leicestershire school children over the years. Ray Harvey presents a feature on the school and its founder, Eric Pinkett. We start at the concert hall.
Welcome to the Montfort Hall to a concert to be given by the Leicestershire School's Symphony Orchestra, conducted for the last time by its own founder-conductor, the Senior Principal Music Advisor for Leicestershire, Eric Pinkett. It is something of a gala occasion, with a number of soloists appearing with the orchestra who are all former members of the Leicestershire County School of Music and now serving as professional musicians in London orchestras. 28 years ago, Eric Pinkett was appointed County Music Advisor for Leicestershire and began the County School of Music. The idea was then new in music education, and as the Leicestershire experiment prospered, became a model for other counties, and may now truly be said, on this occasion of his retirement, that Eric Pinkett has made a unique contribution to the history of music education in this country.
That's how Paul Wright introduced the concert at De Montfort Hall on the 30th of June to celebrate the forthcoming retirement of the founder of the County School of Music, Eric Pinkett. At that concert, I asked the Director of Education for Leicestershire, Andrew Fairburn, how he saw Eric Pinkett, the man.
First of all, a man of remarkable vigour, a man who certainly works 12 hours a day and has done for 28 years and appears to be none the worse for it. Indeed, he looks probably a little younger, if anything, than he may have been 25 or 28 years ago. He has the ability to encourage people to give of their best, particularly young people. As you know, the County School of Music operates on Saturday mornings throughout the term. It also has holiday courses in the holidays as well. And he's there the whole time. Now, he's not a 9 to 4, 5 days a week man. You couldn't do anything of this sort. He's a pioneer, in other words, and is prepared to give a great deal of time to this sort of thing. He can charm parents. He can charm education committees, he can even charm directors of education. And furthermore, he's got a body called the Friends of the County School of Music. Now, you have all that wrapped up in one person, and that is Eric Pinkett.
But how did it all start? What actually brought Eric Pinkett to Leicestershire?
Immediately after the war, I came to Leicestershire because having served the whole of my time doing music, funnily enough, throughout the war and conducting bands and orchestras, and having been a music master in Nottingham before the war, it struck me that I must start again and I mustn't do once more all that I'd done before the war. So that I saw that there was a vacancy in Melton Mowbray, and I rang up the headmaster and went to see him. And I quite honestly believe that I got that job because I'm rather good at games, and he was very anxious to do games well at his school, and I was very anxious to play games too. So that by accident I came to Leicestershire, and after I'd been there for a year, the new director of education, who at that time hadn't been appointed but was an HMI, came to my school to look at the music. And I think one of my other interests is that I paint quite a little. And he was terribly interested in painting, so that I'm not sure that I didn't become the music advisor because I can paint.
And that Director of Education was Stuart Mason. The County School of Music came into being at Elbow Lane School, near the bus station at St Margaret's, on Saturday mornings. It came together as a collection of musicians from a number of different schools.
When we first started, I chose 7 schools in different parts of the county where I myself went and taught them to play the instruments. And at the end of the war, I felt that I could play well enough on most of the instruments of the orchestra. So I spent my time teaching in 7 schools. And quite obviously, I could magnetize the children to play a new instrument for a short period, but after that, it becomes hard work. So I had got to do something to vitalize them. So I brought them in every Saturday to join together and to play as an orchestra. And of course they played very badly, and it was my job then to make sure that they could play to other people, because it's your conceit that makes you anxious to get better and better. So I used to take them to the far-flung parts of the county. First concert I remember was in Church Langton, which in those days was just a little hamlet in the south-east of Leicestershire. And there we did a concert, so-called, and we had a bumper tea, and the headmaster told us how good we were, and that convinced us that we should go on to the next one. So it grew and grew as the years passed by.
And as the years passed by, the staff of the County School of Music grew.
The first thing when we started this County School of Music was me alone, of course. Alone, sole teacher, the complete peripatetic, and of course it was as poor, the whole thing was as poor as you could expect. We were just at the very beginning. And what I needed first was some enthusiasts. Didn't matter whether they were good musicians, it was important that they were so enthusiastic that they would convince all these young people that they should meet every Saturday. Well, that was the first step. The second step was to find characters, because characters, as you do know, are the people that fascinate youngsters. And right out of the blue came my first character, the greatest character in my opinion. We had but one clarinet in that first orchestra, Gerald, who came, first of all, Gerald Neal. And one day Gerald Neal said, could he bring his father along, who had just come out of the services where he'd been a director of music. And so the father came along to see me in his full regalia, as you would imagine. He came dressed for the part and interviewed me. It wasn't me interviewing him, and told me that he was prepared to take a job. Now, if you'll remember, this is nearly 30 years ago, and that the salaries of teachers then must have been something like 600 to 800. And he said, well, now, I will be very pleased to take a job with you. I should like to start at 1,500. And which was very typical of the character, because he started at whatever they gave him, which was very, very poor, because in those days, by his qualification, he wasn't a qualified teacher, so he got a very small pittance. But that was Mr. Neal, our first character, the greatest character. Well, when, as the years went on, of course, as we began to be successful, so we could have more peripatetic teachers, me in the first instance, then myself and Mr. Neal, and that went on for, I should think, 5 years. And then we got part-time violin teachers, not very successful, and eventually we started looking to the service again. Mr. Neal started thinking of those who he knew in the service. And another great character was Mr. Hayworth, Jim Hayworth. Well, he came and we started a second orchestra, and it was so poor, he used to call it Trappers Creek. I think it was a very adequate description of it.
And after the second orchestra came the third orchestra, and onwards went the musical standard. The county school has an impressive list of former pupils that are now in the professional areas of music, playing with well-respected orchestras like the BBC Symphony Orchestra. Joan Clamp, in fact, plays oboe for the BBC Symphony Orchestra. She was a pupil of the Ashby Grammar School. She's now Joan Whiting, and remembers very well how she first came to join the orchestra.
Yes, I approached Mr. Neal, who was the woodwind teacher at that time, and said I'd like to play the oboe, so he fished one out of a cupboard for me, and I sort of struggled along with that for a while. Then he pronounced that he thought I was good enough to play to Mr. Pinkett, and I was filled with horror at this thought, because I was only 12 years old and rather small. And so he said nonsense and kicked me through the door and shoved me in front of Mr. Pinkett's nose and said, play. And that's the sort of treatment one got from Mr. Neal, but it invariably worked. And from then on I came under Mr. Pinkett's influence a bit more and joined the orchestra.
James Watson, a former pupil of Colville Grammar School, is now principal trumpet with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. But when he was 11 years old, he wasn't that keen on actually joining the orchestra.
I came to the orchestra and didn't really like it all that much. I was a brass band boy. I was used to playing the cornet with all men, and I suppose all the girls in the orchestra scared me off a bit. And so I left after about 3 times, and the next time was when I was 14. I'd just won the National Cornet Championships, and I was receiving lots of offers from the big brass bands. And just in time, Mr. Pinkett came over to my school and really dragged me across to the County Youth Orchestra, thankfully. I didn't really want to come, to be quite honest, but once I got there, I really enjoyed myself. In fact, if it hadn't have been for Eric Pinkett then, I would probably now be in a brass band somewhere, and just working in a factory or something like that.
Talking to the soloists at that concert, one became aware of the pattern being repeated, a gifted player always being pushed in the right direction. Eric Pinkett was also very concerned about pushing the orchestra as a whole in the right direction, and his search for new music for the orchestra to play led him to the orchestra's patron, Sir Michael Tippett.
As we got better and better, so I knew I had to stretch the orchestra further and further, and that I had to do other things and things which no one else had attempted. And the time came when I knew that we needed a patron. And my first thoughts were Sir Michael Tippett. And I wrote to him to see if I could come and talk to him about this. And he said, although he was interested and indeed had heard about us, which was very flattering, he said that he didn't think he could come up to Leicestershire to conduct. Indeed, my first thought was to ask him to conduct the orchestra before I asked him to become the patron. So he said he hadn't the time to come up. So I rang him up there and then and said if he hadn't time to come up, then we'd come to him. So I went down to Corsham, which is a village in Wiltshire where he lives. I saw him, and then I went on to the local school and borrowed it from them, which they were very pleased to do, very nicely about all this. And we took the whole orchestra, stayed a week in the school, worked with Sir Michael. He came up every day, and that's how he became part of us.
Moving the orchestra around became a feature of the school, and they moved to the seaside during the holidays at places like Cromer, and later on they went to Brighton. They also went abroad.
But I went along to the Director of Education, Stuart Mason, and suggested to him that a new challenge to us would be if we went overseas. Well, I like a challenge, but he was always one for giving me one, and giving me one probably more than I'd ever expected. So having said this to him, nothing more was said until some 2 or 3 weeks later when he sent for me and said, look, I've arranged that trip for you. He had been in the intervening time to Germany, and he'd called in on Essen and suggested to them that they bring an orchestra to us and that we in return go back and play for them, which was fine, except that when the Essen Orchestra came to us, which they did some few weeks before we went to them, I found that they were a much older group of students of anything up to 25 years of age who played superbly. They came and lived in Birstall. They played concerts around the town, around the county, and their playing was such as to leave me with dismay and wonder what was going to happen when we went to Germany. Quite obviously they played much better than we were likely to, but it was the next stimulant, because having heard them play, the orchestra knew they had to be so much better. So we were always grateful to Essen for starting us off.
Essen was the first of many. The orchestra has now played in every European country and in many of the world's most famous concert halls. They have performed on television, radio, made gramophone records, and played at almost every British festival of note. And they were helped every step of the way by an organisation called the Friends of the Orchestra. Don Mobbs is the chairman of the Friends.
Well, the Friends, I think, quite seriously, we must lay the blame, if you like to call it the blame, at the feet of Eric Pinkett, because some 18, 19 years ago, he did suggest that he could do with some support. And it started really with a small nucleus, mainly of parents of children in the orchestras, who banded together socially as well as financially to support the orchestra in any way they could. Since then, we have grown as an organisation with people now of goodwill towards music, not necessarily parents, and I think that is a very significant point.
I spoke to a number of former pupils, the soloists in fact, on that June concert, and I asked them how it felt to play with the orchestra again on this rather special occasion.
Well, I mean, there's only one word for it, and that's fantastic. Yes, it's marvellous to come back, actually, and see the whole thing flourishing.
Well, it's grown so much. It's unbelievable, really. When I was in it, there was just the one orchestra. Now there are three, I think. The size of it is just fantastic. I just think it's wonderful, marvellous. I'm very pleased to have been asked to come.
Oh, marvellous. Yes, it's very good to come back and help out and do what I can for them.
Yes, well, it's a great honour to be asked. We all think very fondly of Mr. Pinkett, even though we're 100 miles away in London and in the profession now. It's rather frightening in a way because the standard of the orchestra is so high. We tend to forget this, being so far away. Of course, it's nearly 8 years since I left, but I must say I'm very impressed with the sound of the orchestra, and I hope it's going to go well tonight.
Oh, it's a very sentimental occasion, really. I mean, it's nice going back. He has a great rapport between the children, and there's great rapport between him and the children. And there was in my day, and there certainly is now. It's quite obvious. The children love him, and he loves the children. And it comes out in the music, you see.
Reaction there from Nigel Pinkett, Joan Whiting, John Price, James Watson and Rolf Wilson. It was also a sentimental occasion for Peter Lewis, the first leader of the orchestra.
For me tonight, it's really, it's a sentimental journey, I suppose, really. It's a complete cycle from being the first leader to the last leader. So I'm going on just to lead the Enigma. I haven't played the violin for 20 years, mind you, but I'm a viola player now. But I'm going on as a to pay my tribute to Eric Pinkett, who's done a fantastic job here. I wouldn't agree to play the violin for anyone else but him, but I shall go on and go through the motions anyway.
Peter Lewis. Besides performers, the county school has produced many teachers. From the first orchestra, Gerald Neal came back, and so did Malcolm Fletcher.
Well, he was in the very first orchestra that we had. He came one Saturday morning to Elbow Lane where we practiced, stood in the yard. He was only about 12 at the time, stood in the yard, balanced on one leg and the other, and daren't come in. Eventually I went and spoke to him, and he said he was a cellist. And since in the orchestra we had but one cello, this was fine. He got no chance to escape. So he came, was a boy in the orchestra, went off to the Royal Academy. I think he was our first one to go to the Royal Academy. Then he did that at the same time as he did national service, and did neither of them successfully because he'd got his one foot in either section. But when he came back out, he came back to be one of the staff.
Not everyone came back to the fold straight away. Brian Pearce was a member of the first orchestra, but after many years away from the county school, came back in an unusual way.
I, as you do know, over all the years have done a lot of teaching because I enjoy teaching of instruments. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I went into a school where I was teaching, and I noticed a young man was teaching clarinets. And I inquired, he wasn't one of my peripatetic staff, and so I inquired of the head who he was, and he said, well, he's a fellow who has offered to come in and teach. And I found that this man was doing it of his own initiative, completely freely to all these children, spent nearly a whole day there. And I've got a lot of time for a man who wants to work because he loves it. And so at the first opportunity, I offered him a post. Now, it wasn't till this very week that I was talking to a member of staff, and they said Brian Pearce was in the first Roundhill Orchestra.
Yes,
I did not know that. I've only found that out this week.
I asked Peter Lewis to reflect back on the qualities of the man, Eric Pinkett.
Well, the most incredible thing about him is his vision. He thought this thing up right from the very beginning, and each year it improves, it grows. And it grows because he's willing to tackle modern music and classical music. And the combination of the two gives these children such a fantastic range of playing, rhythmically and melodically, that they can just play anything. And I think a lot of youth orchestras stumble because they don't play the full range of music. Mr. Pinkett's got living composers to actually write and come and conduct their music with this orchestra, and this is an experience that no other bands have. They just don't have it. And it's this vision, it's this willingness to stand back and let other people take charge on occasions that has made this orchestra the finest youth orchestra in the country.
From one man with a vision 28 years later to 8 orchestras and 42 teachers serving the city and county. Jack Smith, headmaster at Appleby Magna, has been secretary to the orchestra from 1948.
Yes, well, no doubt that many people have spoken about the fame of this orchestra, but it's not just been achieved front stage. There's been so much support behind the scenes, and particularly from Mrs. Pinkett. She's actually been a gem all the way through. She's been there looking after Mr. Pinkett, and when we've been abroad, you know, people think they ask you when you get back, have you had a good time? Of course you've had a good time, but what has it involved? It's involved looking after children, particularly the girls, and Mrs. Pinkett has been the mother all the time. Perhaps people think we stay in hotels. Many is the time when Mrs. Pinkett's not even unpacked her bags when we've been on tour. Whenever she's had to rough it, she has done, always turned up the next day looking after the girls. Nothing can be said too highly for her, and I feel very privileged to be the one to say it.
Jack Smith. The first part of the history of the County School of Music has now been written, but how does Leicestershire's Director of Education, Andrew Fairburn, see the future?
Well, we've certainly come to a watershed. No one can seek to emulate Eric Pinkett. One needs to look for new dimensions and new directions, but basing these on the enormously firm foundation which he has developed. I see the further development of instrumental work. I see the need to develop conducting amongst teachers, both of instrumental and choral music. And finally, we see now distinctly the possibilities of developing the choral side of the work. Witness the great Europa Cantat Festival. So the future, it seems to me, is extremely rosy, and we're not frightened to strike out in new directions thanks to Eric's firm foundation.
And now the entire de Montfort Hall has come to its feet to greet Eric Pinkett and, yes, an encore, Nimrod from the Enigma Variations.